So today we're here to host a panel discussion exploring the scientific, public policy, and community aspects of PD with Dr. Ray Dorsey. He's the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology at the University of Rochester, where he directs the Center for Health and Technology. And Ted Thompson, who is zooming in from Washington, D.C. He's the Senior Vice President of Public Policy for the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Hi, Ted. And thankfully, Ted and Ray are very good friends. They do a lot of work together, and you're going to find that out today. Also, we're blessed to have Michael Hoblin, the Deputy County Executive here in Rockland. And on Zoom with us is Susan Branham, the Director of the Veterans Service Agency. So just a few facts before we move on. I want to make sure Susan Branham's here also. Okay, Parkinson's disease is a chronic progressive neurological disorder affecting over 1 million people, including approximately 110,000 veterans in the United States. 1 in 6 Americans suffer from a neurological condition, and PD is the fastest growing neurological disease in the world and is the second most common condition to Alzheimer's. As many as 90,000 new cases are diagnosed every year. PD is linked to veterans exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam, to chlorinated solvents in the drinking water at Camp Lejeune, and those who have experienced traumatic brain injury. PD costs Americans at least $58 billion a year. Our focus today is on ending PD. It's the title of the book co-authored by Dr. Dorsey, discussing possible causes and preventative measures. We will discuss today how environmental factors such as pesticides and other toxins may lead to Parkinson's and how public policy might help limit those exposures and protect people from the disease. As one patient observed, if I can prevent just one more case of Parkinson's or prevent Parkinson's among our children, that in my mind is a cure. I want to thank our sponsors, Kaiwo Kirin and Supernus. And without them, we wouldn't be here. So I know that they are the pharmaceutical companies that help us. And thank you. I also want to thank our volunteers, Alita Gelb, Roberta Leitner, Susan Cohen, Simone Schumann, Sam Amdur, and Lenny Amdur. Without you, it would be much harder. If you don't know, I'm Susan Lust, and I'm the co-director of the Parkinson's Wellness Project. We are an independent nonprofit organization. We promote awareness, education, and social interaction for people with Parkinson's and their families. And we serve as a bridge between the community and all of our professionals. We want to break the barrier. We want to demystify this disease, and we all want you to get better. We're trying to help the community take responsibility for their health by proving this is not your grandfather's Parkinson's anymore. So today we're here to host a panel discussion exploring the scientific, public policy, and community aspects of PD with Dr. Ray Dorsey. He's the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology at the University of Rochester, where he directs the Center for Health and Technology. And Ted Thompson, who is zooming in from Washington, D.C. He's the Senior Vice President of Public Policy for the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Hi, Ted. And thankfully, Ted and Ray are very good friends. They do a lot of work together, and you're going to find that out today. Also, we're blessed to have Michael Hoblin, the Deputy County Executive here in Rockland. And on Zoom with us is Susan Branham, the Director of the Veterans Service Agency. So just a few facts before we move on. I want to make sure Susan Branham's here also. Okay, Parkinson's disease is a chronic progressive neurological disorder affecting over 1 million people, including approximately 110,000 veterans in the United States. 1 in 6 Americans suffer from a neurological condition, and PD is the fastest growing neurological disease in the world and is the second most common condition to Alzheimer's. As many as 90,000 new cases are diagnosed every year. PD is linked to veterans exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam, to chlorinated solvents in the drinking water at Camp Lejeune, and those who have experienced traumatic brain injury. PD costs Americans at least $58 billion a year. Our focus today is on ending PD. It's the title of the book co-authored by Dr. Dorsey, discussing possible causes and preventative measures. We will discuss today how environmental factors such as pesticides and other toxins may lead to Parkinson's and how public policy might help limit those exposures and protect people from the disease. As one patient observed, if I can prevent just one more case of Parkinson's or prevent Parkinson's among our children, that in my mind is a cure.
One of the things that I had loved about being a legislator and being a Rockland resident also, as a matter of fact, was the number of amazing people in Rockland who were so involved with various things that were so important to everybody. And when Susan and Maurice came to see me a couple of years ago, and they said that they were working on putting together a new organization. And I was really, really interested because I thought I knew all the organizations in Rockland at that point, and I certainly didn't know anything about a Parkinson's organization. But I think I jumped right into it with you.
You
right?
did. You did.
And
at the Big Tulip Fest that we did at Boulder Stadium.
yes, that's right.
In 2021.
Right. And so I got sucked right in by those two people. And I'm happy to say that it has brought a lot into my life. I've learned a lot, certainly about Parkinson's, and you know, if I didn't say it before, I want to say it again. This is a wonderful book. It really is. And this is the author of the book. So Dr. Ray Dorsey is the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology and Director of the Center for Health and Technology at the University of Rochester. Through creative use of technology, he and his colleagues seek to enable anyone, anywhere to receive care, participate in research, and benefit from therapeutic advances. His research has been published in leading medical, neurology, and economic journals, and has been featured on National Public Radio. In the New York Times and in the Wall Street Journal, in 2015, the White House recognized him as a champion for change for Parkinson's disease. In the book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, he lays out the prescription for action for addressing what he believes is one of the great health challenges of our time.
So good evening, everyone. On behalf of the county executive, I would like to personally welcome everybody here this evening. As I said, I am the deputy county executive, but today I'm here as a former caregiver for my father. who passed away about a decade ago. Last year, I was asked to speak at the Boulder Stadium, as Susan remembers, and having attended multiple events in my military career, multiple events as part of the county, spoken to numerous occasions, I didn't think much of it. However, you can see I became overcome with emotion. So, as many of you here today know, being a caregiver is not an easy task. My dad was a Korean War veteran and a well-known corporate attorney. However, he was no match for this disease. I began to read the book that Susan sent me. I got the hardcover version, thank you. And one thing that struck me, there was a big joke in my family when I was growing up that my dad had no sense of smell. You know, that was decades before he was diagnosed with Parkinsons. I may never know the cause of the disease with my dad. It could be genetics. It could be exposure to contaminants during the Korean War. Nevertheless, through the research of our distinguished panel and dedication of the volunteers of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, I hope we can inch closer to one day ending Parkinson's disease. So on behalf of the county and my dad, thank you for being here this evening. Thank you.
So my name is Susan Branham. I'm director of the Veteran Service Agency of Rockland County. I'm an Army veteran. I served from 1993 to 2000. And what I do is I am an advocate for veterans to get benefits. And what we are seeing is that a lot of veterans have toxic exposure. So through the most recently passed PACT Act, which expands a lot of healthcare and compensation for veterans, we are seeing a lot of veterans coming in with either Parkinson's-like symptoms or Parkinson's disease diagnosis. Veterans, unfortunately, have a lot of toxic exposure from the jobs that they do, whether it's in combat, whether it's burn pits, exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam, or the Camp Lejeune water contamination. There are multiple generations that have been exposed to toxins, and we've even seen some veterans having some of the younger veterans, maybe that were mechanics or working on aircraft, and that jet fuel exposure or fume exposure is causing symptoms of Parkinson's, or actually Parkinson's disease. So what I do is I assist people in getting benefits and understanding what they might be eligible for. So I thank you for having me on this panel.
So today I'm going to argue to you that Parkinson's disease is preventable. That for the vast majority of individuals with the disease, there's no reason that you need to have this disease, and there's no reason that future generations need to have this disease at all. Susan opened by saying this isn't your grandfather's Parkinson's disease. I think we can create a world where your grandchildren do not get Parkinson's disease. I think we can create a world where your children don't get Parkinson's disease. And I'm going to give you some rationale for how we can do that so that we can decrease the number of people affected with the disease, that we can make Parkinson's disease increasingly rare instead of increasingly common. Now, you may say that's great for everyone outside this room. And for future generations, what about me? So it's also, if you don't know what the cause of your disease is, how are you going to change the course of it? So anytime a doctor diagnoses you with the disease, the first question you should ask is, what caused it? First question you should ask is, what caused it? Why is that? I'll give you a couple of reasons. One, you could still be being exposed to what's causing that disease. So if you're diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing the doctor's going to tell you to do? Stop smoking. When you were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, what did the doctor first say? What? They gave you lots of bad news, but no one ever said, why did you get Parkinson's disease? So that's one reason. Second reason is that anyone can name a disease that we can, how many people want to cure Parkinson's? Fantastic. Anyone who can name a disease that we can cure medically where we don't know its cause? Sometimes cancer. So some very, very rare cancers that we know the genetic causes for, and there are pills that modify the genes that we can, and we can cure something surgically by just taking it out. But generally speaking, we don't cure diseases unless we know its causes. I'll give you an example. So how many people remember ulcers, stomach ulcers?
Also,
What was it? What was that thought to be due to? Stress. And so they told you to do what? Calm down. And what happened? Nothing. The ulcer got worse, and lots of people used to die from bleeding ulcers, right? What causes ulcers? Bacteria. What's the treatment? Anyone dying from bleeding ulcers? So that's all in the lifetime of everyone in this room. That we identified the cause of a disease that we thought we knew what the cause was. We were wrong. We identified the cause, highly treatable, and we ended it. So if you know what the cause of a disease is, you are halfway home to getting a cure. Third, and I think most powerfully, is you can create a world where people don't get the disease in the future. How many people worry about getting typhus? How many people worry about getting smallpox? Right, these are all diseases from previous generations. Smallpox killed lots of people. And we live in a world largely free of those. And there's no reason that we can't create a world that's largely free of Parkinson's. So that's what I'm going to give you an overview. Maurice is going to help me with the next slide. So I'm going to argue to you that one, Parkinson's is rising. Two, that Parkinson's is largely man-made. Parkinson's is largely a man-made disease. There are some rare genetic causes of disease, but for the vast majority of people, it's a man-made disease. And as such, Parkinson's is preventable. And Maurice is going to go ahead. Perfect. So why is Parkinson's named Parkinson's disease? Because a man, a 61-year-old surgeon, Dr. James Parkinson, saw something new on the streets of London in 1817. And what he saw was new was he saw people hunched over with a shuffling gait and a little bit of tremor. He'd been around medicine for a long time and practicing for over 30 years. His father was a physician, I believe. And if you think about it, you're 61, you're only going to write an essay, a long essay, by the way, if it's something really catching your eye that's new. And he said that Parkinson's disease, unlike tremor, which has been well characterized for a long period of time, this disease, which he called the shaking palsy, is not been classified in the medical literature. He's describing something that is not described in the medical literature, something that is rare, and something that is new. And what's going on in London 1817? What's going on in London 1817? We've got some historians here. Industrial Revolution, and what's the capital of the Industrial Revolution? London. And what's the air quality hanging out in London in 1800? There it is. So the London fog has little to do with weather and everything to do with air pollution. How many people remember June in Rockland County? Air quality was?
oh, yeah.
Air quality in Rockland County in June was what 1800 London looked like.
Wow.
So if you want to live a short and unhealthy life and a life full of brain diseases, breathe toxic air. And that's exactly what was happening in 1800 London. Next slide. And if you look at the rates of Parkinson's, we've heard from Susan that's the world's fastest growing brain disease. If it were just a genetic disease, you would expect to be just randomly, rates of Parkinson's would be essentially uniform throughout the entire world. We generally share genetics, all humans share the similar genetics, but it's not. Rates of Parkinson's are 5 times higher in the United States and Canada than they are in the least industrialized parts of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa. 5 times higher in industrialized parts than they are in the least industrialized parts. And they're increasing most rapidly in areas of the world that are undergoing the most rapid industrialization, including India and China. China's rates of Parkinson's adjusted for age have more than doubled in just 25 years. Could that be genetics? No. Next slide. So I'm going to argue it's largely man-made. And what do I mean by man-made? Next slide. So 100 years ago, I'm sorry, today, lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer death in the United States, leading cause of cancer death in the world. 100 years ago, lung cancer in the United States essentially did not exist. 100 years ago in 1923 in Rockland, there was almost no lung cancer. And that's not my opinion. This is a nice graph. So here's lung cancer deaths. And you can see in the United States, if you go down here to like 1930, you extrapolate down to 1923, you get to the answer of almost 0. It was so rare that doctors and students would all gather around when they saw a case, considering a once in a lifetime oddity, thinking they would never see another case again. They were wrong, unfortunately, because 25 years after cigarettes were introduced into the United States, you see a corresponding rise in lung cancer deaths. 1962, the Surgeon General says smoking causes lung cancer. 25 soon thereafter, cigarette smoking decreased in the United States. 25 years later, you see a corresponding decrease in rates of lung cancer. It's not just lung cancer. Next slide. So how many of you have teenagers, children, grandchildren? So I got 4 boys, and my wife and I have 4 boys, and I was asked one day, well, what's the purpose of acne? So a friend said, what's acne? And she says, well, it could be a disease of Western civilization. I go, what do you mean by that? And she sends me to this article from the Archives of Dermatology, where researchers went and looked at hunter-gatherer populations in Papua New Guinea and in Paraguay, and searched those populations for acne. And do you know how much acne they found? None. Doesn't exist. Does not exist. Acne, the authors postulated could be due to our high glycemic loads in our diets and high levels of insulin that teenagers experience. Next slide. What about the heritability of Parkinson's? So there are rare genetic causes. LRRK2 mutations account for about 2 to 3% of individuals with Parkinson's disease. But even if you carry that genetic mutation, you are more likely than not to never develop the disease. So again, even if you have a LRRK2 mutation, which is the most common genetic mutation responsible for Parkinson's disease, most people with that disease do not develop Parkinson's disease. Only about 40% do. GBA mutations are more common, about 5 to 10% of the population, but the risk of developing Parkinson's is only about 10% for those. My colleague Bas Bloom, who's the senior author on the book, took data from Nature Review Genetics and looked at the heritability of diseases. It goes from 0 to 1, type 1 diabetes, autoimmune destruction of the pancreas, the cells that produce insulin, is very heritable, runs in families. Other diseases, especially mental health diseases like schizophrenia, tend to run strongly in families. Near the bottom of the list, among the least heritable of all these conditions, is Parkinson's disease. Among the least heritable of conditions. And if you think about it, common conditions are unlikely to be heritable. Right? Rare conditions can be survived, but over 200,000 years, if a disease had a strong inheritance, it would get weeded out over time. So Parkinson's is among the least heritable of conditions. Next slide. So what is causing Parkinson's disease? So here are the 3, I think, most important factors for Parkinson's disease, all tied to the environment, all readily preventable, all readily preventable. The first one is air pollution, and I alluded to that a little bit earlier about Dr. Parkinson's, and I'll show you some graphs on that. Air pollution as a whole costs humans on average 3 years of life expectancy. So worldwide, each of us would live 3 years longer if it weren't for air pollution. Second are certain pesticides, many of which are nerve toxins. They're designed to be toxic to nerve cells. The most offensive of these is a pesticide called paraquat that over 30 countries, including China, has banned, but the United States still permits its use. In fact, the use of paraquat, including in upstate New York, has doubled over the last 5 years. Ted Thompson and his colleagues are working hard to prevent that from happening. It's used on corn, it's used on cotton, and it's used on vineyards, among other cases. And then trichloroethylene, which is what I was grabbing, because I don't go anywhere without my trichloroethylene model. So most of you know water is H2O, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, so 3 atoms. Trichloroethylene is whopping 6 atoms. This is a very, very, very simple molecule. It's got 2 carbon atoms in black, 1 in hydrogen atom in white, and 3 chlorines, hence its name trichloroethylene, in blue. It's soluble in water. This is the same chemical that's at Camp Lejeune. This is the same chemical that's contaminated Rockland County, as I'll show to you in a little bit. This is the same chemical that was in Woburn, Massachusetts, and led kids getting leukemia in the movie and the book of Civil Action. It's the same chemical that was in Toms River, New Jersey, caused those kids to get leukemia. You guys remember this stuff? Yes, no? A very closely related chemical. It's called perchloroethylene. It's got 1 more blue chlorine atom. on it, and that's still used in dry cleaning. And I'm going to talk about trichloroethylene, but most of the time perchloroethylene, the closely related chemical, is very likely to have similar toxicity to this chemical, at least with respect to Parkinson's. And this is everywhere. And if I'm a little bit on the crazy side, as you've probably gathered already, I think this might be the most important cause of Parkinson's in the United States. Next slide. So this is air pollution in London. So when you look at air pollution, you can see air pollution, right? Everyone has seen air pollution. Everyone saw. So what are you actually seeing? So you're seeing particulate matter, is the fancy term for it. You're actually seeing little pieces of dirt and soot in the air. And the big pieces of dirt and soot, you either get caught in the hairs in your nose and you sneeze it out, or you cough it out, and you can actually see when you cough it out. The tiny little particles, some of them 1/30th the width of my hair, 1/30th the width of your hair, can go in, they can enter your nose, and then they go back to the smell center of your brain. And hitchhiking on the tiny particles are toxic metals: lead from leaded gasoline, iron from brakes, platinum from catalytic converters. And indeed, if you look at the brains of people with Parkinson's, what do they have high levels of? They have high levels of metals in their brain, such as iron in their brain. And so I told you that air pollution used to be really bad in 1800 London. It was 30 times as bad as it was today. One of the great public health achievements of the last 50 years has been a decline in air pollution, right? So many of you watched the TV series The Crown. Yes, The Crown. Yeah. And so you saw the Great Smog of 1952 cost 12,000 people in London their lives, led to mass hospitalizations, and 3 years later, the first Clean Air Act in modern civilization, and was incredibly helpful. Just like people remember LA in the 1950s and 60s, the governor of California said that we should eliminate all unnecessary driving in the 1960s. That governor was Ronald Reagan. And so 1800 London had particulate matter that was as bad as New York City was in June, as bad as modern day Delhi, India today. New York City had worse air quality in June than Delhi, India does. And people saw during the COVID pandemic how quickly the air quality in India cleared up, where people could see the Himalayan mountains for the first time, all preventable. Next slide. So this is paraquat. So this is the most toxic weed killer that's ever been created. It kills, at least that's what it's been said to be. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's been used to commit homicide and suicide. Suicides rose so much, I believe, in South Korea that the South Korean government banned paraquat. After they banned paraquat, rates of suicide in South Korea decreased, especially among farmers. It's so toxic that over 30 countries, including China, have banned it, but the United States has not. Because you guys aren't making your voices heard, and we're not making our voices heard. That's why. And Ted Thompson, they got 100,000 signatures, and it's not enough. Are we not in New Jersey? We're not almost in New Jersey. So Senator Cory Booker, just a little bit south of where we're standing right now, has introduced a bill into the Senate that would ban paraquat. I looked on some little website, what they said the chances of it passing were? 0. So I think politicians, with respect, respond to issues that the constituents bring to them. And I don't think anyone's brought this to them. And so next slide. In October of 2022, so 1 year ago, reporters for The Guardian, it's a British investigative journal, looked at files from the company that manufactures paraquat, because they're being sued by farmers who've developed Parkinson's disease, and found out that they were concealing the risks associated with paraquat for over 50 years. Next slide. Among the things that they found was that in 1962, paraquat was introduced in the United Kingdom and then later in the United States. In 1964, they found, their own scientists found that skin exposure to paraquat in high doses caused rabbits to develop weakness and incoordination. 2 years later, companies find that large doses of paraquat in some rats and mice result in a stiff gait or tremors. So for over 50 years before I was born, the company manufacturing paraquat documented the clinical features of Parkinson's disease in not one, not two, but 3 different species of animals. And it's still used. In 1974, regulators are concerned about workers, quote, who might inadvertently lick small quantities of paraquat residue off their lips or inhale paraquat mist. Rumors circulate that some in the EPA favor banning paraquat. The EPA's own website says that 1 sip can kill. The EPA's own website right now says 1 sip can kill. In 1985, there was a study from Canada that showed a near perfect correlation between rates of pesticide use in agriculture areas in Canada and rates of Parkinson's disease. The correlation was 0.967. For those of you who remember anything about statistics, correlation coefficients go from 0 to 1, like perfect correlation. So if you looked at height and basketball players, you know, even that wouldn't have a correlation of 0.967, but pesticide use and Parkinson's disease does. An internal memo from the company warned that paraquat could become a huge legal liability like asbestos, and said that Parkinson's can go on for decades, and they were exactly right. Next slide. So what is all of this? This should all sound really, really, really familiar to you, because this is exactly what tobacco companies did with cigarettes. This is what companies manufacturing CFCs talked about with respect to the ozone layers. This is what car manufacturers talked about when Ralph Nader wanted to get introduced seatbelts. This is this is a term called agnotology, which was introduced to me by my friend who's an English professor, and I had no idea what this word was. So Amit, what is agnotology? And he goes, agnotology is the intentional production of ignorance or doubt, often for commercial gain. So silence is a deliberate production of knowledge. Agnotology is a deliberate production of ignorance. And it's used by tobacco companies classically, who had an internal slogan of doubt is our product. Tobacco manufacturers, if you recall, never said smoking was safe or good for you. They did say that was good for you in the past, but in more recent times, they never said it was good for you. They just said we need more research. It's uncertain. There's never been a randomized controlled trial, smokers versus non-smokers. We need more research, you know, seeking anything to delay, so that they can sell more and more of their product. And over 50 years later, the same approach could be being applied to Parkinson's disease. And if you think if this is being applied to paraquat, you should be asking what other chemicals is this occurring for not just Parkinson's disease, but for what other diseases? Next slide. So this is trichloroethylene. So this is a widely used chemical. So how many of you used typewriter correction fluid? So that had trichloroethylene in it. How many of you used a carpet cleaner? Trichloroethylene. This is a very common degreaser. So Susan was talking about military who were using jet engines, and I forgot what the other thing was. Oh, mechanics. So they used huge amounts of trichloroethylene. So I don't think it's fuel that's actually the problem for people in terms of Parkinson's. I think it's more likely this chemical. Anyone used to drink decaffeinated coffee in the 1970s? This was used to decaffeinate coffee. Next slide. So it's been used, as we heard, to decaffeinate coffee, to degrease metals and dry clean clothes. The very closely related chemical perchloroethylene, the one that's got, one additional chlorine atom on it, so it's got prefix per, is still used to dry clean clothes. So if you want to think about if you have Parkinson's disease, I would avoid this chemical and the dry cleaning. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so I'm sorry to hear that. What kind of cancer did he die from? Pancreatic. So lots of people weren't a thing, and East Fishkill had not only the people who worked with it, but there was contamination from the facility in East Fishkill, which is right next to, do you know what it's right next to? John Jay High School. So there's a plant in East Fishkill, New York, not too far from here, that was contaminated with TCE and PCE. It gets into the groundwater, it moves, and then evaporates from the groundwater in the soil and enters people's homes, workplaces, and schools undetected. After they found in East Fishkill, New York, after they put a water filtration system in the high school, they still found the chemical. So that means not only were the people like your father who were working with trichloroethylene at a facility at risk for its toxic effects, but everyone in the community, including their children. Next slide. So TC is associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's, a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's. This study was done by Dr. Sam Goldman and Dr. Caroline Tanner, who are both at University of California, San Francisco. This was done a decade ago. And they looked at twins who either worked with TCE, looked at twins from World War II who either worked with it or had a hobby exposure to TCE, and compared rates of Parkinson's among those individuals to those without. Rates of Parkinson's were 6 times higher, a 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's comparing to twins who didn't work or have a hobby exposure. And like smoking and lung cancer, you don't smoke a cigarette and get a lung cancer the next day. It takes years for cancer to develop. It takes years or decades for Parkinson's to develop. Indeed, they found that the time lag between exposure and diagnosis could be 10 to 40 years. And they're not prone to hyperbole. I might be prone to hyperbole, but Drs. Tanner and Goldman are not prone to hyperbole, but they said that the potential public health implications are substantial because of how commonly used it is. Next slide. And as you indicated, it causes cancer. And there's no question about this. According to the World Health Organization, TCE is carcinogenic to humans. The Department of Health and Human Services says exactly the same thing. The EPA says it's carcinogenic to human by all routes of exposure. So whether you ingest it, whether you inhale it, whether it comes into contact with your skin, according to the EPA, it causes cancer. The cancers that are most well associated with are liver cancer, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancer, and multiple myeloma. Next slide. And so this thing was everywhere. In 1970, 600 million pounds of TCE were produced in the United States. That's 2 pounds for every person in this room. So all of us who were alive in 1970 had 2 pounds of TCE potential exposure. A study in Italy found that 3/4, I think, of men in Italy in the 1970s had TCE in their blood or urine. And it was, Susan, I talked about aircraft and jet engine mechanics. So there it is, #1 answer on the list of occupations with possible TCE exposure: automobile workers, commuter specialists, electronic manufacturers, painters, printers, refrigerant manufacturers, taxidermists, and varnish workers. And you can see the wide range of commercial and consumer uses, as well as the number of industrial uses and military uses is found at numerous military bases throughout the United States, including Camp Lejeune, are contaminated with this chemical. Next slide. So if you worked with it, it's estimated that in 1970, 10 million Americans like your father worked with it. 10 million Americans. It's estimated in the United Kingdom, 1 in 12 workers. That's like saying like everyone in retail worked with TCE. United Kingdom, 1 in 12 workers worked with TCE. So that's one way to get exposed. But lots of people get exposed in their environment. So you can be next to a military plant, industrial plant, or just simply a dry cleaner. TCE is inappropriately disposed of. Sometimes it leaks legitimately from sewer lines, and it goes into the groundwater. So groundwater is about 15 to 50 feet below the ground. And it contaminates the groundwater. 1/3, up to 1/3 of the groundwater in the United States is thought to be contaminated with this chemical today. 1/3 of the groundwater is contaminated with it today. And then this groundwater, it moves. There's like a river, and it can then move a mile or more. And then the chemical is really volatile. That's why it's used in dry cleaning, for example. And it evaporates and can enter people's homes, schools, or workplaces undetected. Next slide. So this is Camp Lejeune. So for how many people know about Camp Lejeune? So from 1953, 1987, Camp Lejeune was contaminated with TCE at levels that were over 3,000 times deemed to be safe. Part of the there were multiple sources of contamination. One was from a dry cleaner because Navy officers need to get their uniforms dry cleaned, served in the Army. Navy officers needed to get their uniforms dry cleaned. Unfortunately, the dry cleaner ABC cleaners didn't quite dispose of it. Well, was inappropriately disposed of. I don't know who inappropriately disposed of it and contaminated the drinking water there. So for anyone been to a Marine base, an Army base, these are not small little things. These are like, imagine like Ohio State University or something along those lines. It's estimated that 1 million Marines, their dependents, spouses and children and civilians were exposed to contaminated drinking water at Camp Lejeune from 53 to 87. Dr. Sam Goldman, Dr. Caroline Tanner, those two researchers who did that study on twins, sought to assess the risk of Parkinson's disease among Marines who served at Camp Lejeune in the 1970s and compared it to Marines who served on the West Coast and at Camp Pendleton. And they found that the Marines who served at Camp Lejeune had a 70% higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease compared to Marines at Camp Pendleton. Mind you that Marines almost by definition are healthy. So these Marines were on average 20 years old when they were at Camp Lejeune. You don't stay at a Marine base or a military base for long periods of time. They were there for on average only 2 years, some for much shorter period of time. And 30 years later, these previously healthy Marines are being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And I just told you that this isn't just at Camp Lejeune. I told you this about Woburn, Massachusetts. I told you this is in Toms River, New Jersey. I told you, you told me that it's in East Fishkill, New York. Next slide. And these contaminated sites are everywhere. In Michigan alone, it's estimated that there are thousands of these sites. This is just a picture of a plume, just to give you a flavor of what it is. So this is trichloroethylene or TCE from an automobile manufacturer where it dissolves into the groundwater and forms this underground plume. This one's about 4 miles in length. So you can imagine if you live, work, or study on any facility that's on top of this plume, you're at risk for the TCE coming into that place and you're breathing it in. And we've already heard that one of the earliest features of Parkinson's disease is loss of smell. One of the other earliest features of Parkinson's disease is constipation, suggesting, at least to me, and I think to lots of other people, that Parkinson's disease is beginning either in the nose or in the gut. And indeed, if it's beginning in the nose or the gut, that's the likely portals of entry for exposure to these environmental toxicants. So you can either inhale TC, for example, or you can drink it from contaminated water, much like pesticides, much like air pollution. Next slide. And it turns out that Rockland County is not spared either. So every time I give a talk, I just go into Google and I type in the place I'm going to, and I type in trichloroethylene, and almost every time I find a contaminated site. So do you guys know about this site? Do you guys know about this site that's contaminated in Rockland County? It's on 169 Western Highway, West Nyack. Yes, yes. Am I speaking? So this is Ray Dorsey reading reports from the Department of Environmental Conservation. I am not an environmental scientist. I'm not a toxicologist. If I got something wrong, please forgive me. But in 1926, this site here in red was acquired by K Research and K Laboratories. In 1927, there was a 40-gallon spill of unknown chemicals resulting in abnormal taste of water that was downstream of the water plant. The site was subsequently sold to this company. In 1978, a Pine View Road resident, I assume that means something to you guys, Pine View Road, reports change in the taste in their well water, and elevated levels of TCE were found in their well water. And I'm sorry, Pine View Road in 1978. So that's like 45 years ago. In 1983 to 85, there were additional environmental investigations. In 1992, 14 years after this resident identifies abnormal taste, the site is listed as a Class 2 site by the Department of Environmental Conservation, which poses, quote, a significant threat to public health, or the environment, or is listed as a Superfund site. In 1994, so now we're 16 years later, TCE is found in the groundwater as high in concentrations as high as 160,000 parts per billion. The safety threshold is 5. So 30,000 times higher than that found at Camp Lejeune, as far as I know, are found in the groundwater in Rockland County, like 2 or 3 miles from where we're standing right now. In 2002, 24 years after, a remedial system is in operation. So this is in Rockland County. You don't have to go to Camp Lejeune. You don't have to go to Wormwood, Massachusetts. You don't have to go to Toms River. You don't have to go to East Fishkill. This is in Rockland County. This happens, I think, on the next slide. And this is 5 minutes from my house in suburban Rochester, New York, where all the doctors and lawyers live. Is a former metal plating and printing operation that had used TCE to degrease. So imagine if you're paint, anytime you have metal, you have to get rid of grease. And they found the maximum concentrations at 130,000 parts per billion, not quite as bad as it is here in Rockland County. And they found that the indoor air of this building, so this is a huge building in 2013, some 30 years after the contamination likely took place. So you can imagine what's going on in the intervening 30 years, that the indoor air found to be contaminated throughout the building. The beautiful, easy thing is that this thing is easily remediable. How many of you had your home tested for radon? Yes. And how many people have ever had a radon remediation system put in? Anyone found it? Yeah. So you put a radon remediation system that sucks the air from underneath your foundation, vents it above your roof, and you're protected from it. Very easy to do that. They put a subslab depressurization system, I just call radon remediation system, in place, and subsequent air levels are below the safety threshold. Next slide. And this has been going on forever. So tonight you can watch a civil action starring John Travolta and learn about Woburn, Massachusetts, where the drinking water was contaminated with trichloroethylene and children developed leukemia in this town north of Boston. Toms River, New Jersey. Dan Fagan wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book about these same chemicals contaminating that community. Next slide. So that's the bad news. The good news is all preventable. So if I'm right that these environmental toxicants are underlying the rise of Parkinson's disease and many other diseases, including many cancers, this is preventable. We need not have this disease, just like these chemicals weren't around when Dr. Parkinson was describing Parkinson's disease in 1817, because he was describing a rare condition. There weren't synthetic pesticides in 1817. There was no trichloroethylene in 1817. The only thing he was likely seeing was, for most part, was air pollution. So this is preventable. Next slide. So there's only one high quality study that has demonstrated that the incidence of Parkinson's disease is falling, and that's in the Netherlands, where they found a 60% decrease in the incidence of Parkinson's in 10 years. 60% decrease in the number of new cases adjusted for age in the Netherlands in 10 years. So I went retrospectively backwards, and I said, let's look at the 3 things that I think are most important for Parkinson's disease: air pollution, pesticides, and trichloroethylene. I told you that air quality in Western Europe, the United States, has improved by 50 to 90% over the last 50 years. And indeed, emissions of common air pollutants decreased by more than 50% between 1990 and 2012 in the Netherlands. Pesticides, many of these pesticides dissolve in fat, like DDT. They dissolve in fat, and so that they can be measured, and your brain is a fatty organ, it's covered in fat. And so they looked between 1968 and 1986, levels of DDT and other pesticides linked to Parkinson's disease, including dieldrin, dropped in fat tissue of humans between 75 and 90%. In 18 years, you can drop levels of fat-soluble pesticides by almost 90% in a really short period of time. So not just your grandchildren need not get Parkinson's disease, your children don't need to get Parkinson's disease, your nephews, your nieces, your spouses may not need to get Parkinson's disease. And in 1981, levels of trichloroethylene in the Netherlands were among the lowest in all of Europe. Associated, not necessarily causing it, but associated with that is a 60% decrease in incidence of Parkinson's disease. So if we can do that in the Netherlands, why can't we do that in the United States? Why can't we do that for the rest of the world? Why can't we create a world without Parkinson's? Next slide. So my son is my 4 sons. The third is a budding philosopher. And so he talks, just instead of knowing about football quarterbacks, he knows about philosophers. And one day he asked me, Dad, do you know who Derek Parfit is? Anyone who know who Derek Parfit is? Yeah, so I was ignorant as well. He was very displeased. Dad, how can you not know who Derek Parfit is? He's only the most influential philosopher of the second half of the 20th century. So one of his proteges, Derek Parfit's proteges, he's in Oxford. My son's in Oxford for the term, is William McCaskill, and he wrote this really good book about what we owe the future. And if you think about it, we owe the future a lot because we've received a lot of gifts from previous generations. We live in a world where polio is incredibly rare and almost doesn't exist. We live in a world where drinking and driving is socially unacceptable. And we live in a world where HIV is not only treatable, but it's preventable. And those are all gifts that we've received from previous generations. And just like you have an obligation to receive a gift, you also have an obligation to reciprocate. And I think we can create a world that's largely free of Parkinson's disease. And I'm going to show you how each of these individuals like Susan and Maurice create a world where polio, drinking, driving, and HIV are all on the decline. So next slide. So in 1938, there was a March of Dimes because Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who likely had polio, was in office, and people raised money to change the course of polio. Some of you remember, the only treatment, the primary treatment for bad cases of polio was an iron lung, which was basically an external means of keeping people alive who were too weak to breathe. And so in 1938, the March of Dimes began. They mailed so many dimes to the White House that the White House mailroom nearly shut down. If you've looked at a dime, anyone's got a dime, you will see the picture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It was so effective that they've now banned people from mailing coins to the White House because people were so good at doing so. How many years after the March of Dimes did we get a polio vaccine? Early 50s. So early 50s, early 50s was the first trials. Jonas Salk, 55, polio vaccine. 17 years after people got their act together, made their voices, led by people like Susan Maurice Lust, and changed the course of polio. Today, polio is non-existent in the United States. None of us worry about getting polio. There's no effective treatment for polio still today, and it's nearly eradicated from the entire world. Next slide. Anyone know Candace Lightner? I don't know why no one knows. I didn't know her either. So Candace Lightner, in 1980, her daughter, Carrie Lightner, was a 12-year-old girl walking when a drunk driver hit her, knocked her out of her shoes, and she died. And it turned out that person who had killed her had been arrested or had been found to be, I think arrested for drinking and driving like a week earlier. 4 days after her daughter is killed, she launches a campaign that would become MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Every day for a year, she was in California, she went to Governor Jerry Brown's office to change the course of drinking and driving. In 1980, drinking and driving was legal in some states in the United States. The drinking age was 18, and the blood alcohol level was really high. 8 years later, in the course of 8 years, led by an ordinary woman, extraordinary woman, Candace Lightner, drinking and driving is banned in all 50 states. Drinking age is raised from 18 to 21. Blood alcohol levels dropped to 0.08. Number of deaths due to drunk driving is estimated to have decreased by 10,000 per year. 10,000 lives per year because Candace Lightner's daughter was killed. So this is after the fact. She didn't say we need better emergency rooms, better trauma services. She didn't say we need better spinal cord rehab. She didn't say we need to stop drinking and driving. There are some of us in this room, some of our friends and family members who are likely alive and walking because of people like Candace Lightner. And the beauty of it is none of us know who it is. Next slide. Not far from where we are in 1987, New York Times reports a rare cancer called Kaposi sarcoma is being found among gay men. 1987, New York Times. Some of you read that article. federal response to HIV in the 1980s was none. There was no federal response to HIV in the 1980s. The only thing that happened is that people were blamed for the diseases that they were getting. And Larry Kramer and a group of ordinary, largely men and women, in 1980 said, this is not, this is unsatisfying. That was very nice. That was understated. They formed an organization called ACT UP, and their motto was silence equals death. And they were everything but being polite. They made all of us uncomfortable, or at least many of us uncomfortable. They barricaded themselves in the streets of New York. I'm telling you, some of you what you already know. They overtook the New York Stock Exchange. They overtook the FDA. They overtook pharmaceutical companies, changed the course of HIV. People remember Magic Johnson getting diagnosed with HIV in 1990, and so everyone thought Magic Johnson was going to die, but protease inhibitors were developed in 1995. So 8 years after ACT UP was formed, protease inhibitors were developed and allowed people with HIV to live near normal life expectancy. You're diagnosed with HIV today, you can have a near normal life expectancy. And even more powerfully, they helped identify what the cause was and came up with a very simple solution called a condom that prevented millions of people from ever getting the disease. Again, there are people in this room or friends and family members who likely do not have HIV because of the courage of ordinary Americans right across the river from where we're sitting today. Next slide. So if we can do this for polio, if we can do this for drinking and driving, if we can do this for HIV, we can certainly do this for Parkinson's disease. So what should you do? One, you should join the PD Avengers, which is a global grassroots organization run and led by people directly affected by the disease. Two, you can sign up for our newsletter and you can hear reports. You can just sign up right there, or you can just go to the website right now. Three, you can tell your representative to ban paraquat, trichloroethylene, and perchloroethylene, and to support the National Bill to End Parkinson's Act, which Ted Thompson is very understated. Ted Thompson, I think he and his colleagues drafted that bill, and it's supported by the Michael J. Fox Foundation. He's going to tell you more about that. We also need to notify individuals who are at risk. So I don't think anyone here knew about anyone know about the Rockland County trichlor? So you didn't know. So why is that? The Rockland County contaminated site. So I thought you go to a Superfund site like in East Fishkill, New York, you would see people in hazmat suits and fences and things like that. You see nothing. You can be driving past a dry cleaning site that can be a Superfund site or state Superfund site. There are 3 near where I live, and there's no notice whatsoever. Your kids can be breathing in TC contaminated air like they are in Newport Beach, California, and they don't even know. So there needs to be notification of people at risk. You can read our book. We have additional, I think about 8 more copies out here. If you can't get one, you can purchase one on Amazon. All the authors are donating all of our proceeds to prevent and end Parkinson's. If you can't afford one, you have a friend who can't afford one, you just email us at info@endingpd.org with your mailing address, and we will send you one for free. We need to hold wrongdoers accountable. Because if we don't hold wrongdoers accountable, they only get emboldened and they will only continue to do this. And, you know, if they're going to do this for Parkinson's, what other diseases are they doing this for? So in close, yeah, yes.
Very often, the organization that owns the water flips it over to someone else, so you never really know quite who it is or what it is. So I just wonder about that in terms of the people who own the water. What do they do? How do we reach them?
So you guys will know better than I do. But private wells are not regulated by this. Most city water is regulated by the safe. All city water is regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, created in the early 1970s. So TCE should be tested for it and should be screened out. I'll just say should be. And then private wells, which up to 40 million Americans get their water from a private well, which resides on their own property. That's not covered by the Safe Drinking Water Act. So people can be at risk for drinking either pesticide contaminated or these chemicals could be in their drinking water, and often are infrequently tested, and often when tested, not even tested for these chemicals. So if other people can change, if ordinary people can change the course of polio, if they can change the course of drinking and driving, if they can change the course of HIV, we can do exactly the same. And I would say not only can we, but I think we actually have a responsibility to do so. Because you've now heard, you've now been educated, you've now been seeing a little bit. And the only reason that Parkinson's will persist is because we do nothing. The only reason that Parkinson's will persist is because if we do nothing. But if we make our voices heard, if we work with people like Ted Thompson, the Michael J. Fox Foundation, if we work with others, we can change the course of Parkinson's disease, that people can read in textbooks in the future about how ordinary people here in Rockland County started to change the course of Parkinson's disease. I can't think of a better gift for future generations. Thanks.
So Ted, would you like to join us?
Absolutely. It's tough to follow Ray. He's quite the evangelist.
Yeah.
As you can tell, I've learned a lot from him. I started working with him originally around telemedicine about 10 years ago, but he and I have been on this environmental risk factor journey now for several years. What he concluded with was that we have a responsibility to act and to take action, raise our voices. In the chat, I'm going to put a link where you can sign up to be an advocate to do just that. We brought public policy into the Michael J. Fox Foundation about 7.5 years ago. It was previously done by an independent Parkinson's organization that I ran. And shortly after we came into the Fox Foundation, one of our friends at another Parkinson's organization told me about paraquat and wondered why it wasn't banned in the United States. So that led us on a now roughly 7-year journey that I'll give you a very brief update on. But I do have to correct, I rarely have to correct somebody like Ray Dorsey, but his numbers were way off on how many countries have banned paraquat, including all EU countries. 72 countries around the world have banned paraquat, and there's, I think, 195 countries. So we're almost at half the countries in the world. And China, as Ray noted, is one of the countries that has banned it, yet ChemChina owns the company that manufactures it. It's banned in the UK, yet it's manufactured in the UK. So it's still very present, very heavily used. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that Ray already covered in terms of the correlation between paraquat and Parkinson's, but just to give you an update on what we've been doing. He did reference a change.org petition that we submitted to the EPA several years ago that got, I think, over 114,000 signatures. We had twice submitted all the scientific evidence that we had at that time to the EPA linking Parkinson's to paraquat to Parkinson's. Yet 2 summers ago, the EPA decided to reapprove paraquat in the United States. And when they do a reapproval, it's good for 15 years. So we were left with one last option, and we chose to take it. We joined with a couple of farm worker groups and environmental groups and filed a lawsuit against the EPA. So we are currently suing the EPA for its decision to reapprove paraquat. The investigative reporting that Ray referred to from The Guardian, I think actually made a difference in what EPA is doing, because what the EPA then requested about a year into the lawsuit, they said, hey, we want to reconsider things. Can we put the lawsuit into what's called abeyance? Basically, it's putting the lawsuit on the bookshelf. And so they're going through a re-review of the data. We've submitted even more scientific evidence, even stronger evidence that they are currently considering. And in the end, and then 2 weeks ago, we actually had a meeting with EPA officials, and we had three patients join to tell their paraquat story. One of the patients is virtually catatonic. He couldn't talk, so his wife spoke for him. But it clearly made a difference in terms of putting the human face to the disease and to the connection of paraquat. And because the lawsuit is technically ongoing, they couldn't give us a whole lot. But I ended it by saying, you know, part of our journey is to try and prevent Parkinson's disease. You can prevent it by eliminating known triggers, known risk factors. And that's what we're asking the EPA to do, is to prevent people from ever being diagnosed with Parkinson's due to this exposure. So we have been very active with that. Ray did mention legislation that Senator Cory Booker has introduced. In addition to banning paraquat, it would also immediately require the EPA to re-review roughly 90 chemicals that are in use in the United States but are banned in the EU. It's like, you know, what does the EU know that we don't? Well, I think they're more forward thinking. Ray once asked me, or his assistant once asked me, well, when is Booker's bill going to be voted on? And I sarcastically said, the day before never. It's never going to get a vote, at least not in this climate. Maybe pieces of it can make it into the farm bill that's underway right now. But that kind of a comprehensive reform of our pesticide approval process in our political climate, when people cannot even agree on facts in order to develop different alternative responses, it's really unfortunate, but that's where we sit. As everybody knows, in addition to our lawsuit against the EPA, farmers have filed multiple lawsuits. There's class action suits against the manufacturers. And I raise it, we are not involved in any of that, just so you're aware. But I raise it because oftentimes good public policy happens not because policymakers make it happen, but because lawyers sue the wrongdoers. And the cost is so expensive that the wrongdoers quit doing that kind of business. And legislators finally step up and enact laws like, you know, laws for airbags, seatbelts, anti-drunk driving, et cetera. So there's activity on paraquat on multiple fronts. On TCE, that's another one that we're heavily focused on. We have filed formal comments through the regulatory process on TCE. We've also had a meeting with different, well, one of the same EPA officials, but we actually had a meeting to talk to EPA about TCE, highlighted the Camp Lejeune study. It was a very good meeting, and on that meeting, they were a little freer to talk, and any day now, the EPA will be releasing its new regulations around TCE, and they said that we would like them. So I'm anticipating that if not a complete ban, that there will be some sort of ban of TCE and very severe restrictions on the use of TCE. So we're holding out hope that we're going to get a victory there. I did want to mention that there were two states, my home state of Minnesota and your home state of New York, that have partial or complete TCE bans. They're the only two states that have some sort of ban. Both of them, unfortunately, were prompted by catastrophic events in the two states. But our plan, if we don't get a good result from the EPA, then we're going to shift our strategy toward state legislatures. And I'm sure the county legislators understand this, but Congress doesn't work very quickly, and they don't work very effectively oftentimes. But at the state and local level, they take action. You know, they have to pass budgets. They have to get their work done. They can't kick everything, all the cans down the road like Congress does. So taking this to the state level would be the next step. One threat to this, though, happening in Congress right now is there's a major effort underway for a preemption clause in the Farm Bill. And what preemption means, and I've seen it before, I've been around, I've worked for a couple of different congressmen, so I've seen this circus before, and it's never succeeded. But the attempt by the people pushing for preemption is to forbid local and state governments to have stronger environmental laws than the federal law, which in this case would mean that New York and Minnesota would not have been able to ban TCE. So that's a very direct example. So we're obviously fighting against that. We think that local governments should have the power to protect their citizens. Another thing we are looking at, and if folks were interested in a local angle that could be done, probably even by the county legislature, is transparency legislation. In the state of California, since the 1970s, they've had a pesticide registry. And so the data, what pesticides are applied, where it's applied, and how much it is applied is all reported to the state, which gives the state data that creates heat maps. And so you can see visually, well, obviously visually, exactly where the heaviest use of these various pesticides are. That has resulted in a lot of the paraquat scientific studies, actually, by Carly Tanner, around what's known as Pesticide Alley. It's the Central Valley counties of California that has huge amount of agriculture. There are ways, and so the transparency concept would be, if we can't get an outright ban because industry is going to fight it tooth and nail, what's the harm in at least knowing where these chemicals are being used? Because in the end, legislators are going to care if their constituents are being poisoned or killed because of the application of these dangerous chemicals. And through that transparency, it could drive much greater support by the public at large to push legislative bodies to make changes and to ban some of these chemicals. So that's another area that we're looking at. Air pollution, Ray had mentioned that one. The government or the administration is coming out with some new air quality rules. We again submitted formal comments on that, but we were pushing for this absolute strictest regulation of air quality because of the connection to Parkinson's that Ray really focused on. One of the most interesting parts of my job here that I never expected was the intersection of working on the disease and the environment. I actually, both of the congressmen I worked for were heavily involved in environmental issues. The first one, Clean Air Act amendments, Superfund sites, brownfields, a lot of things you don't even hear about anymore because we have lost our focus on protecting and cleaning up the environment. Yet Ray so vividly showed us just how much danger is lurking out there. And I'm sure we have all been exposed to a lot of these things without our knowledge. So there's a lot of work to be done from that standpoint. Yesterday, I was actually in New York. I was going to try to make it to your event in person, but for personal reasons, I had to get back here. But I do want to tell you that a major focus of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, you all know we fund a lot of research. Obviously, it's up to about $2 billion in 22 years. But our focus is really on preventing the disease. And there's more than one way to prevent the disease. We're talking about one way, which is eliminate the environmental risk factors, which are believed to account for 75 to 80% of Parkinson's, and that the unique genetic features are more like 20%. And there's a gene environment interaction that plays a role. But so we actually have, as part of our PPMI study, which was the study that ended up discovering the first biomarker for Parkinson's, we announced in April, which is an absolute game changer for the community and for industry. And it's really going to speed research, we believe, and the test, the biomarker test, will be an affordable test at some point. Right now, it's a spinal test, which is not very convenient, and it's about $1,500. But we've been told that we're going to see a urine test or a blood test, so it could actually become part of one's annual physical, and I mean, it could be part of the annual Medicare wellness check, but by 65, it might be too late, honestly. But if we could get it in annual physicals as part of your regular blood test, we might be able to identify people decades ahead. And that would be a game changer too, because studying people who are likely to get Parkinson's, there are different interventions that can happen to possibly prevent the disease, slow the progression, stop the progression. So we have in fact, part of our study, it's called Pwp, Path to Prevention. So it's an exciting time from a research perspective for Parkinson's, and we've actually had a lot of new products that have come on the market over the last 8 to 10 years. So we view that it's time to put your foot on the gas pedal even more, and that happens through the research we're funding, but it also happens through getting people engaged as advocates on behalf of the community. Before I wanted to give you one quick update that is New York specific. You all may or may not be aware that we've been pushing to create a New York Parkinson's disease registry. We actually got it enacted, or we got it past the state Senate, but ran out of time at the state House. And so my team is going to be pushing in 2024 to get the Parkinson's disease registry enacted in New York. And the reason it's important, one, to get a more accurate reflection of the population of New Yorkers with the disease, but it's the other data that can be collected that could advance research. In fact, last year we hosted a data summit to come up with 3 different data collection efforts. Very basic would just be prevalence, how many people in the state have the disease. And then 2 higher levels that would be increasingly more valuable to the research community. New York is our big target for 2024. We have one in California that's been going for several years. Nebraska is the oldest one from 1996, and this year we were able to get a significant increase in funding for that registry and to modernize it, because they were literally still using faxes and mailed in copies and things like that. And I know you're not Nebraskans, but I'm just going to tell a quick story about an advocate that was with me, and she was one of the driving forces to get the registry enacted originally in Nebraska. But we were sitting down with then freshman U.S. Senator Deb Fisher of Nebraska. And this woman's name is Monty. Monty had some handouts, and one of them was a map of Nebraska. And it showed different colors where Parkinson's is the highest prevalence of Parkinson's. And the senator naturally asked, well, why is that? And before Monty could answer, the senator answered it. She's like, oh my goodness, that's all the rural community. There aren't even many people there, but they've got the highest prevalence and it's not even populated. It's because of the pesticides, right? And we're like, yep. But that was one person, one senator. We need a lot more senators, a lot more congressmen, a lot more state legislators and county legislators to be aware of this. I mean, if everybody would listen to Ray's talk, everybody in a position of power, and take off their partisan hats and their industry, funding their campaigns, whatever it might be, it is really hard to conclude that we should sit on our hands and do nothing. And so, it's unbelievable that in the wealthiest nation on earth that we don't take greater care of our population. So anyway, on the New York registry, if anybody's interested in getting involved in that, I'll put the email for Zach Hardy, who's our person leading that effort at the foundation here. So now I want to, and one other initiative that was mentioned in my bio was the National Neurological Conditions Surveillance System. We pushed that for about, and this shows you how long it takes in Congress to get things done. We pushed that for about 10 years before we got it enacted, and then it took another 2 years to get it funded. But the CDC, it's housed at the CDC, and it's an effort by the CDC to truly come up with the most accurate numbers for the number of people with Parkinson's in the United States. It is going to include data on Parkinsonisms as well, because we don't just focus on Parkinson's, we also focus on Parkinsonisms. And these state registries are collecting data on Parkinsonisms as well. But the report was actually going to be released before the government shutdown, and everybody was 99.9% sure the federal government was going to shut down. So they hit the pause button on it. But that report should be coming out imminently, and that data is going to be extremely helpful for us as well from a research perspective and a messaging perspective, frankly, because the more we can highlight the impact of the disease, the more attention we can get from decision makers. But I want to focus now on the National Plan to End Parkinson's Act that was referenced. This, without any shame or embarrassment, we have been copying our good friends over at the Alzheimer's Association. They put numbers to their disease many years ago with an economic burden report. So one of the first things I did when I got at the foundation here, I said, we got great stories, we've got Michael, we've got all this stuff. We don't have good hard facts. We need better data. So we embarked on a 2-year study to come up with the most comprehensive cost of disease, burden of disease report that showed that based on 2017 data, $52 billion a year, and it's expected to be around 80 billion a year in 2037, which sounds like a long time from now. It really isn't that long from now. It's only 14 years. And so and half of that cost is paid for by the federal government. And to put it into context, the federal government currently funds about $260 million in Parkinson's research, and they spend 100 times more than that to care for people with Parkinson's, primarily through Medicare. So clearly the investment by the federal government isn't what it needs to be, and they really need to step up their game. And so that leads into, in part, the National Plan to End Parkinson's Act. The legislation is modeled after the National Alzheimer's Plan. And we literally, yes, we wrote it, but we copy pasted and edited to make it Parkinson's specific. We also added a few things that weren't in Alzheimer's, namely items around environment, because we know that there are the environmental risk factors. And so we really want the National Institute on Environmental Health Sciences to be a part of this national plan. So what the plan does is it creates a federal and non-federal advisory committee, and they are charged with basically looking at everything Parkinson's related in the federal government, including what level of research investments they're making. Ultimately, that is what drove the dramatic increase in federal research investments for Alzheimer's. And so we're hoping that as a result of this national plan advisory committee, not only can we identify better care models and things like that, but we can spur dramatic increases in funding for Parkinson's research. And to put this into context, when the Alzheimer's Association started on this journey and pushed for their national plan, Alzheimer's was being funded at about $300 million a year. And we were probably about 90 million for Parkinson's. Fast forward to this current fiscal year, they are now at $3.5 billion, and we're at 260 million. So it's been dramatic increase, and I won't get into all the minutia on that, but again, we're trying to replicate essentially what our friends did there, because they've been extraordinarily successful. So people ask, well, how did they do it? And why did the HIV/AIDS community, how could they be so successful? And the answer is really right in front of us. Both of those groups built an army of volunteers. And now no public official can have a town meeting or anything without somebody standing up telling the story of Alzheimer's. And they don't even necessarily need an ask. They don't have to say, I want you to support bill number HR 1234. It can be as simple as, listen, my husband has Parkinson's, this is the impact it has had on our family, on our kids, whatever it might. So just telling the story, and then the ask can be, will you do more to support Parkinson's research? And it doesn't, oh, excuse me, dog's barking. Hey, Cooper. He turns 17 on Halloween. He's got a little doggy dementia, and he's a little confused. My wife is not here right now, so apologies. And now I lost my train of thought. The army of volunteers. I mean, that is really the key. And we've been really working on increasing our number of advocates here at the foundation. We've tripled the number of advocates that have signed up to take action since 2021. So that's good if we can keep at that pace. We're at about 65,000 people, and we need a couple 100,000 people signed up to take action and help, because that's the only way. And Harriet will confirm this, I'm sure. That is the way people get noticed, the way their priorities get a higher priority. So the National Plan to End Parkinson's Act is the biggest, boldest legislative effort ever on behalf of the Parkinson's community. So I'm going to put some information on the chat on that, and I'm hoping that Susan can email these links out as well to the people in the audience. But one date to mark down on your calendar is October 25th. We are having a National Day of Action. Basically, it's a day to inundate Congress with phone calls and emails asking them to pass the National Plan to End Parkinson's Act. So that is part of our overall initiative. I'm happy to report that we currently have 25% of the House of Representatives and 20% of the US Senate as co-sponsors of the bill. Those numbers are important. They are a good metric. But what's most important is getting the right people supporting the bill. And we do, in this case, have one of the most important right people supporting the bill. And his name may never even show up on anything because he's the Senate Majority Leader. And they often, when you're in leadership, you typically don't co-sponsor a lot of bills. But Michael has personally got involved in this effort. And he had a call with Senator Schumer last year. And the senator assured him he would do anything and everything he can to make sure this gets across the finish line. And as you're probably all aware, Senator Schumer's mother has Parkinson's. So that's just one example of one person who can be extraordinarily important in this effort to enact this legislation. So like I said, I'm going to drop a few things in the chat for people. And I know we're almost at time, so I'm going to stop there and just thank everybody for attending and thank Susan and everybody for hosting this event, and I hope I can make it up to one of these in person one of these days.
Paraquat and trichloroethylene perchloroethylene. I'll say trichloroethylene perchloroethylene degrade really slowly. Trichloroethylene perchloroethylene have very similar chemical structure to forever chemicals. They have this bond between a carbon atom and remember those blue atoms. Those are hard to break, so they degrade slowly. I don't know. Paraquat, I think, lasts a long time in the soil. And it can also contaminate groundwater. I don't know if it, Ted, do you know anything about the degradation of paraquat?
I don't, but one thing I did learn as part of this lawsuit, the firm we're using is called Earth Justice. They used to be known as the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund. But one of the things that I didn't know about paraquat is, you know, they spray it on the food, and it is supposedly not, you know, harmful to eat the food afterward, but it gets on the crops and it gets in the ground. And so when the farmers, so there's a double risk. One is when it's being sprayed, but the other risk is when the farmers are going through with their equipment and harvesting their crops, it's kicking up all this dry paraquat dust. And so it is like a double contamination possibility. And that was one of the things that in the lawsuit that they really highlighted, that and the fact that the EPA didn't even follow their normal process because our argument was they didn't even seriously consider the Parkinson's paraquat connection.
So, yeah, paraquat is only allowed to be used, Ted will correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I know, again, I'm not a lawyer, in agricultural uses by farmers, but there are pesticides that people used every day and have used and continue to use that likely increase your risk of developing Parkinson's disease. The first person that Dr. Parkinson described was with Parkinson's was actually a gardener. Now, there weren't synthetic pesticides in 1817, but plants produce their own pesticides because they don't like to be eaten. And so chrysanthemums, mums, produce a class of pesticides called pyrethrins, which are nerve toxins that have been linked to Parkinson's disease.
First of all, you should know that paraquat degrades very, very slowly. So it's going to be around for a very long time because of its molecular structure, number one. Also, we used to have crop dusting because God knows we didn't want to have insects in our environment, you know, like upstate New York and the Catskills. And that was going on for quite some time. Basically, I know that I used to live next door to somebody that works for the water company. When his wife got pregnant, he ordered water in. That's when I knew that it was time to do something drastic. Too late for us, but we could do that at any rate. Yeah.
I just want to acknowledge that this is a wonderful 2 hours that I spent here. It's educational, it's inspiring, and thank you very much to the other speaker as well. I also want to thank Susan, who referred us, Susan from Rockland County of Veterans Services, to refer us to come here, spend the time, and I'm glad we did. I do have a question on TCE. I work on the flight line for many years when I was in the military, and degreasing solution is a must for us. We take it everywhere we go. We never see any skull or crossbones to remind us how some of this stuff can be harmful to us. So we get by with CB, we get by with 7th lane, a number of these well-known products. We just use it. We never think much about it. But one of the things that I'm not sure you can draw a relationship, and I just want to make it clear is we're also exposed to JP4 and JP8 a lot, especially the JP8. Have there been any correlation between the exposure to the JP4 and the JP8 to the Parkinson's?
This is an incredible educational 2 hours that we spent here with you, Dr. Dorsey, Michael, Susan, and Ted. And I thank you very much all for coming out to the chambers. Thank you for hosting us, Legislator Cornell. Thank you for being here from Washington and from your home, and everybody who Zoomed in. We have a lot of work ahead of us.